Good morning and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining our webinar. I'm Jeff Antos from the Weinberg Group, and I'll be moderating today's session on understanding what the FDA is looking for in post-market assessments, going beyond AERS. The Weinberg Group is a regulatory and scientific consulting firm serving pharma, biotech, and device clients. We are headquartered in Washington, D.C. I know you're really going to enjoy our speaker today. Dr. Bob Roth is the Weinberg Group's medical director. He holds 2 doctorates, a Ph.D. in biochemistry from Baylor and an M.D. from the University of Texas at Galveston. Bob provides consultation in all phases of research, development, and marketing of FDA-related drugs, biologics, and medical devices. A noted author and speaker, Bob has led numerous projects in pharmacovigilance. Take it away, Bob.
Thank you very much, Jeff. What I'd like to do today is give everybody a brief overview of options that are out there for drug manufacturers for drug safety surveillance activities. I'm sure that most of you are aware of AERS, which is the FDA's adverse event database system. What we'd really like to talk about today is a little bit about AERS, but mainly all the other options that can go into, a company's either routine drug safety surveillance or focused activities, perhaps very often in the context of putting together an NDA. As just a way of introduction, the past few years, I think what everyone has seen is that FDA's focus not only is for new and innovative, effective drugs, but safer drugs. And with all the major drug toxicity problems, blockbusters taken off the market, FDA has they've taken a lot of heat over the years for drugs that got approved and then had to be withdrawn, situations like that. So what FDA is really requiring of drug manufacturer sponsors is an extensive safety profile to begin with for the approval, and then a drug safety post-market safety surveillance program that hopefully is sensitive enough to pick up problems that may have been missed during development. Again, by way of introduction, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today really began to be put into public focus a few years ago when FDA published their Safe Use Initiative back in 2009. And the focus of this particular FDA publication was actually on unnecessary injuries from drugs. This was preventable medical errors and misuse. The context was that literally hundreds of thousands of injuries and fatalities a year that are associated with drug use and misuse would actually be considered preventable. And FDA has, in various sources, have estimated that anywhere between a low of 10% and as much as a half of injuries are actually preventable if everyone is paying attention. So the Safe Use Initiative talked about interventions that could be made across systems. These are patients and providers, caretakers, insurers, other federal agencies like the DEA and CDC, and everybody taking a part in paying attention to drug safety. Then identifying particular drugs and particular problems that have been identified and keeping track of them prospectively. This is something that FDA does internally, and the whole idea is to be able to recognize something that may or may not turn out to be a verifiable problem. If it does, be able to do something before there's a lot of harm. And FDA does this routinely in-house. They have a very a very good and I think pretty complete safety surveillance system in-house where they look at their own data and over time and determine if there's some sort of problems. And so they've, sorry, go to the next slide. What they have, FDA has done is developed a list of drug candidates. This is a growing list. These are drugs that are followed internally. These lists are published. There's safety alerts for human medical products, drugs, and therapeutic biologics, and the public can go and see what this list consists of. These are drugs that have been identified with certain concerns, safety concerns, but at this point there's no conclusion that there's even a problem, let alone a problem that needs to be fixed with something like a withdrawal or a change in a label. It's simply a list of drugs and problems that everyone should know that FDA has their eyes on. And the basic concept that comes out of the Safe Use Initiative is the quote in the bottom bullet on this slide, that the majority of harm that you get from approved drugs is actually fixable and comes from things like misuse, inappropriate use, medical mix-ups, and the like. So I wanted to very quickly just give a case example of Propoxyphene, because this is one of the first drugs that sort of in the process of looking at the safety of this drug. A lot of the post-market surveillance databases I'll talk about for the rest of this talk sort of first became part of the public awareness. So this goes back to 2006 when Public Citizen requested that Propoxyphene be taken off the market, and this was mostly related to suicide risks. And a few years later, FDA actually did put out a review of the Propoxyphene evaluation that they had done. They've acknowledged that there was evidence for overdose situations, but they did not go to the point of saying that there was an acknowledged suicide risk at that point. What they did point out to, which had not been a major focus previously, was a risk of cardiotoxicity. And FDA's main concern at that point was whether or not cardiac toxicity should be the reason for removing the drug from the market. And what they recommended at that time were some safety studies. A year later, after further updated review, they did eventually recommend that the drug be withdrawn. And the reason at that time were fatal arrhythmias. Now, the drug safety sources that FDA evaluated for this decision are the ones that we're going to be talking about today. First of all, there was AERS, FDA's own adverse event system. And what was clear from AERS that there were many Propoxyphene-associated deaths and many suicides. They also looked at mortality data that came from medical examiner data in the U.S. and also suicide data from some sources abroad. They reviewed the DAWN system, the Drug Abuse Warning Network system of data. This is one of the sources that we'll talk about a little bit later in the talk. They evaluated data that came from the National Poison Control Centers. We'll talk about that, and those data also talked about fatalities and suicide attempts. And so these are sort of the the basic data sources that FDA evaluated, and then ultimately came to a conclusion about risk versus benefit. Now, the data sources I want to talk about today are briefly AERS, and then get into an analogous system called the VigiBase that's run by the WHO, then get to the Drug Abuse Warning Network, DAWN, the poison control, and then a few words about safety surveillance via analysis of electronic medical records. The basis for considering all of these different sources is number one, that FDA's Safe Use Initiative brought them all up as available information sources that can have utility and actually and don't necessarily overlap completely, so you can get some independent information. These sources were all identified in a number of times over the years in different groups associated with the FDA, and going back to 2005. Division of Risk Evaluation mentioned AERS, DAWN, and the poison control system. There was discussion of these sources in front of advisory committees and even a House committee. I should say that there is no obligation that a drug company or anyone else has to follow or evaluate their drug safety in any of these sources. Certainly, most people will pay some attention to AERS because that is the U.S. FDA system. But there is certainly no official mandate that any of these other systems be evaluated. However, as FDA has said in a number of places, there really can be some very good utility to paying attention to these sources. Just briefly about AERS, I'm assuming that most of you are somewhat familiar with the MedWatch and AERS system. It's a database of MedWatch reports that are submitted by physicians and pharmacists and customers and other sources. Most of the information in AERS falls into the regulatory category of a medically important, a serious adverse event. The AERS system is a large and irregularly updated database that's published with quarterly updates. The safety information that goes in is QC'd in some fashion, and so there is a lag period between when a case gets into AERS and when it shows up in a quarterly publication. And this is generally a 3 to 4 month lag. So if on January 1st you're looking for AERS information on your drug of interest, the last entry that you may be able to find is likely to be many, many months before that. The information in AERS can change. Many of you are aware that there's an initial MedWatch report, and then in many cases additional information comes in, and a follow-up report is submitted, and so that the record in AERS can be a changing record over time. There can be follow-up information, clarifications, and duplicate reports can be weaned out so that from one point of time to another, a report can change. Should be aware that the publicly available information in an AERS quarterly update does not provide narratives. Surprisingly, not all FDA reviewers know this, and they'll sometimes ask for narratives when new drug applications are put in, and we have to educate them that narratives are not available. Through FOI requests, it is possible to get a full MedWatch report with narrative, but this is, if any of you have done FOI request previously. It's a one-by-one request. Weeks or months can go by, and it's just simply not practical for any kind of routine safety surveillance. Should say that there are a number of ways to look within the AERS database to try to understand whether or not there are some interesting associations between drugs and side effects, changes over time. FDA itself uses data mining procedures routinely to look for strengths of drug adverse event associations, and this process is basically what allows them to create their list of safety alerts that we talked about previously. The other thing that's possible within the AERS system are what are called standard MEDRA queries. MEDRA is the coding language for adverse events. And so you may have a particular interest in your drug, say, of pancreatitis, and you could simply go to AERS and see how many reports there are of pancreatitis. But there are lots and lots of other terms that could show up in an AERS report that would not necessarily say pancreatitis, but would be but would represent that issue. And this is what the standard MEDRA queries do. They're groups of terms that together represent the concepts of interest. These can be names of disorders, signs, symptoms, diagnoses, syndromes, physical findings. And so I just presented here as an example. If you are interested in a granulocytosis is a potential side effect of the drug, here's the various preferred terms that a given case could have been coded as. So you can see if you simply look for a granulocytosis, you would miss many of these other cases. And so the SMQ process is a way to get a better view of a disease process. So that's all I was going to say about AERS. VigiBase is a very similar system. It's adverse event data, much like the AERS system, but it's much more worldwide. It's run by the WHO and maintained by the Uppsala Monitoring Center. It's a voluntary system, and countries around the world will submit adverse event information will be submitted to a national database in pretty much every country around the world, and then in some cases countries will also submit their information to VigiBase, and so it's a fair number of participating countries. It's basically the same information that goes into a MedWatch report. Contrary to the FDA process, there's not really a QC step that's available in here. The material, if you're interested in your particular drug and what adverse events exist in VigiBase, it's possible to obtain this information. It takes anywhere from a few days to a couple weeks. There's a small cost, but it does have to be ordered and paid for via the Uppsala Center. And what we use VigiBase very routinely in drug submissions, and the value the way that we use the database is we will extract out all information, all cases that have originated from the U.S. with the assumption that these cases were already reported in AERS. And so we end up with a database that we call an ex-U.S. Safety data set, and we use that to compare and contrast with what we find independently from an AERS analysis. There are some differences between AERS and VigiBase. One is that AERS, as I mentioned, is updated and then published as a quarterly update report, whereas VigiBase is maintained regularly, and every day, in essence, you can get a different and more updated data set. The AERS information is predominantly coming from the U.S., whereas the VigiBase data are predominantly from countries other than the U.S., and we found it particularly useful in looking at adverse events in Asian populations that are generally very, very poorly represented in AERS, but you can simply focus your VigiBase search on adverse events that originate from China, Japan, Korea, and specific Asian countries if you want, and pick out those data that are most likely related to an Asian population specifically. The other thing that we found every time that we do this exercise is that whereas AERS reports are generally considered serious, most of the information in VigiBase is actually non-serious. I'd like to next go to the Drug Abuse Warning Network, to the DAWN system. These are data that are collected from emergency rooms. It's a nationally representative database of over 1,000 ERs. The information includes drug-related deaths coming from medical examiners and toxicities, if you will, and complications that are seen in emergency rooms. The system, the data system, is operated by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, so it's not an FDA related database, but SAMHSA. The SAMHSA program has gone through a number of changes over the years. Several years ago, about a decade ago, it was redesigned as New Dawn, and then it was actually, for confidentiality reasons, a further redesign was made that actually closed the system for a couple of years, and then it reappeared recently as the Substance Abuse Mental Health Data Archive. What the public can get from DAWN are number one, some general reports if you're of interest, but they turn out not to be very useful for drug surveillance, or you can actually obtain what are called the public use files, which are the actual data sets of cases that are compiled from these emergency room visits. And the new DAWN system that just started up again several months ago was one in which annual reports now are being generated. So at this point in time, there are, I guess, 9 annual reports that are available, and you look year by year. So unfortunately, if you're interested in a long-term view of your drug of interest in DAWN, you have to evaluate and analyze each of the annual reports. What's represented in DAWN are prescription and OTC medications, illegal drugs, dietary supplements, alcohol, non-pharmaceutical inhalants. So it's a broader view of toxic compounds than what you see in AERS, but it does include some information that is related to drugs, our drugs of interest. The information that you see in a DAWN record, number one, a case is categorized as by some drug-related category name: abuse, addiction, detox, misuse, things like that. So you get sort of a general category that the case is considered. there are, I should mention that again, like in AERS, there are no available narratives. So the story, which I believe is actually in Dawn someplace, is not publicly available. In addition, if you see information that really is reflective of an adverse event, the presentation of this information is not like an AERS. There's no body system presentations or use of terminology that would be consistent. So it's really quite a different way of presenting drug information. What you see in a Dawn evaluation, if you're interested in your particular drug of interest, you can get the number of reports that have been submitted over that year. You get patient demographics, and this does include race identification, which is not present in AERS or VigiBase. There are 7 general categories of what are called reasons for the emergency room visit that I've listed here, one of which is called adverse reaction, but the others obviously are more drug abuse related and poisoning related categories. Information that falls under the context of disposition includes what has happened to the patient, and the options are that the patient was treated in the emergency room and released. Release could be sent home or sent to jail or someplace else, but not to a hospital. And then a second disposition category is admitted to the hospital. The records do give information for what kind of unit, if you will, within the hospital one gets admitted to, and then there's a category of others. So it is possible if you know from a record that the patient was seen in the emergency room and then released to and admitted to a surgical unit in the hospital, that this would qualify as a hospitalization, as you would see in an AERS and a MedWatch situation. Jumping now to the National Poison Data System. This is information that comes from the American Association of Poison Control Centers. So it's independent of Dawn, but it's a somewhat analogous system, but these are the poison centers. This previously had the name of TESS, but more recently called the NPDES. There's 64 major poison control centers. This is a real-time toxicovigilance system. Cases when patients are seen in a poison control center, there's pretty much an instant electronic submission of the case information to the database, and so this is really a real-time data source. There is some adverse event information, it's somewhat limited, but there is some. Again, no narratives. And if you want to evaluate the information in poison control, you need to go through the AAPCC, put in a request that has to be reviewed and accepted by that group. And there is a form, a fairly complete form that has to be filled out, and there's a very high charge. Not to give numbers to things, but in essence, you will be charged by the number of specific drugs that you're searching for, and by the number of years that you're looking. So the charges can grow quite rapidly. The information that you get from a database from the NPDES are demographic information, age, gender, weight, whether or not a woman is pregnant, the quantities of exposures that are ingested, and then a number of reasons for exposure. On the left-hand side in this table is what's called adverse drug reaction, which is pretty much the closest to what we would call a drug AE. I should point out that the actual intent of an adverse drug reaction is to be able to describe situations that come from normal use exposures, so normal prescription use of the drug. So the intent is to exclude problems, and there could be adverse events, but problems that come from misuse, suicide attempts, and things of that nature. I think, as you can see from this slide, the most common type of category that you see is unintentional therapeutic error, which represents things like incorrect dosing, inadvertently taking someone else's medicine, infant exposures via breast milk, things of that nature. Sometimes this sort of information can actually be helpful when tied into specific, adverse event information that you might be able to glean from a case. Each case is defined by an outcome, and these are the lists of outcomes. So there's no greater definition of these outcomes than this, but major, moderate, minor, potentially toxic. This is the sort of information that when we use the database for evaluating a marketed drug's safety for, say, an NDA submission for a 505(b)(2) product, we'll use this information to make the case that most of the occurrences that show up in the poison control centers are perhaps minor effects associated with this drug, and that's not really a problem. In terms of the adverse events and what you can get out of the poison control database, is extremely limited. As many of you are aware, there are tens of thousands of adverse event terms in AERS, for instance, so that can describe a particular drug side effect. In the poison control database, there's a little over 100 terms, and these are terms that were not chosen to represent drug adverse events. These were chosen to reflect, poisoning problems, so like burns and acidosis. And so most of the information that you see in the clinical effects portion of a poison control record are not really related to the drug per se. But when you're looking up the side effects, whatever is reported, the side effects of your drug, there'll be one or two terms that reflect something to do with an organ toxicity. We use these four basic data sources fairly routinely for drugs, for many drug submissions. Certainly not all. They have been recommended, the group of them, by FDA for pediatric drug submissions when there's not a great deal of pre-market safety data. Obviously, drugs with potential abuse, FDA maybe want to look at each of these sources. If a drug has a potential need for a special formulation or packaging to make it safe and not abusable, obviously those sorts of drugs would fall into this category. And then we've seen in many times drugs that are undergoing a process of Rx to OTC switch, FDA wants, before FDA concludes that it's safe to market this drug without a physician being involved, they would like to know what sort of safety information exists in each of these sources. Now, one other fairly recent concept that FDA has been promoting is what they call their Sentinel Initiative, and I'd like to just say a couple words about this. These, as I mentioned, the adverse event information in AERS, for instance, is cases that were submitted to MedRush reports submitted to AERS from sometimes patients themselves or physicians or pharmacists, but this is generally the considered tip of the iceberg. Most side effects don't get reported. People don't take the time or don't have the interest. So the Sentinel Initiative is a way that FDA is trying to get access to a more broad view of drug side effects. So they're looking at drug safety information that comes from sources like electronic health records, insurance databases, and registries as a way to sort of collect much more of that iceberg of data. So for a comparison, at this point, FDA has what they call a pilot, a mini Sentinel project, where they now have greater than 100 data from more than 100 million individuals in terms of drug safety and adverse event information. This would compare to AERS that has a small, very, very small fraction of that information. The last quarterly update, when we looked at a drug in AERS, had about 150,000 reports. So obviously, 100 times or greater source of information in the Sentinel Initiative process. A couple things about electronic medical records. I mean, it sounds like a wonderful idea for finding out all sorts of drug side effect information, and probably this is the wave of the future. Because, like I said, most adverse events don't actually get reported to FDA, so this is a way to avoid the problem of underreportability. What needs to be developed are better systems to prompt physicians to have some sort of recognition of adverse events in the hospital notes, and in addition, some way for pharmaceutical companies to use this sort of information, and that's really in its infancy at this point. What you can get are a fairly representative view of safety and safety signals that come out of lab reports, in a hospital record, progress reports, physician and nursing progress reports. All of this information potentially is a way to pinpoint some organ toxicity or some other side effect that would be generally ignored, for the most part. There is an issue that's sort of in progress, being worked out in progress, which has to do with coding of this information. As I mentioned, the AERS information and also the VigiBase works with a large number of coded terms, the MEDRA terms for specific adverse events. And when a physician writes a note in a chart, obviously does not use MEDRA terminology. So there needs to be a way of translating what the words that show up in a medical record into adverse event terminology that can be compared with these other sources in some way. And this is where there's quite a bit of current advance in terms of natural language processing and ways, computer system ways to take information and put it into some format in which it's possible to compare one record to another. An actual case that we ran into a couple of years ago was quite interesting. FDA actually required a sponsor when they were putting in an NDA to do an electronic medical record review. This actually turned out to be a huge process. It cost an incredible amount of money. It took 6 months or more to accomplish. Protocol had to be written. Software had to be generated for analysis and all that. But the question in this particular case had to do with a drug that would mask, that would treat some symptoms in a situation where the symptoms themselves could be the first indication of an underlying, in this case, an underlying cancer. So this was a particular situation where there was potential of a renal-related cancer, and if renal symptoms were suppressed by the drug, could that hide the cancer so that it was not diagnosed until later? And the only way to answer a question like that would be with electronic medical records and look at long-term follow-up of patients. And it was actually possible to answer the FDA question to their satisfaction via this approach. And one last source of information I just wanted to mention very, very briefly. Didn't put together a slide on it, but there was just a very recent publication that I noticed a week or two ago. But there's now the beginning of drug safety data mining that's being done via the internet. And there was a very interesting publication. We wrote a brief blog on it on our website if you're interested, but it was a way that the authors would look at internet search sites. They focused on Google, Yahoo, and I think a couple of the other major sites. And they were trying to answer the question of whether or not it would be possible using searches, just simple, search evaluations to look for potential drug interactions. So what they did is they looked at all the Google searches over a period of time and looked for associations between two drugs of interest and a side effect, and we're able to identify that that two particular specific drugs were in a group of search terms associated with a side effect much more often than other drug combinations, and it was an identification of a potential drug interaction that actually in this case turned out to likely be real. So this is again probably at this point more an academic process, but at some point it's almost certain that FDA will start themselves using internet search approaches to trying to find out specific drug problems. So to conclude, just the basic messages from this webinar are that there are a large number of drug safety databases that go beyond AERS, and FDA has in some instances asked for several to all of these sources of information. FDA is promoting a wide safety evaluation for risk management, and so we have seen in a number of instances where they will ask that companies prospectively follow some or all of these these data sources and keep an internal record of what they're finding, similar to doing routine literature searches, for instance. There are currently some hot spots, if you will, narcotic products and pediatric products where it's much more likely that some or all of these data sources would be followed in some way as opposed to just AERS. But I think over time, the groups of products that will be evaluated by these various sources are clearly getting larger and larger. The data sets are complementary. You just don't see a case that's reported in Dawn and also clearly in AERS. It's actually difficult to know necessarily, but the preliminary view is that the information is generally complementary. The bigger problem is that there's no easy way to integrate the information. So when if a drug submission is made and these sources are all reviewed and analyzed for the integrated safety analysis, the analyses are separate, they're individual. Last comment is that this kind of process is somewhat time consuming. Certainly if poison control information is involved, the expense can be considerable. However, we've found many companies now, larger drug companies, are using these sources routinely so that they are kept aware and so that they can provide a convincing argument to FDA that in fact they're doing the best that they can. And with that, I'd like to finish, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Bob. We've got a number of questions here. Let me start out with one from one of our participants. And the question is, why do we not normally tap the safety database of electronic medical record reviews for post-marketing reporting?
Well, the main reason is because it's a pain. You have to write a protocol. The IT people have to be involved for software analysis so that you can be sure of the data that you collect and analyze. There's HIPAA requirements, IRB approvals. So there's a number of steps that get involved. That means that this process costs a lot and takes a lot of time. So it's just not practical on a routine basis. And I mean, I certainly would not recommend that anyone start off with a electronic medical record analysis for anything routine. I'd certainly recommend that you wait until FDA requires it. But the main thing is the costs and time. It's not trivial. It's not something that someone a regulatory person can do at their desk. Okay.
That makes sense. Thanks. Another question, could you explain a little bit more about FOI, how that works?
Well, the Freedom of Information Act says that data that it would include FDA data are available upon request. There's a company called FOI Services that one can go to and request information that is made available to the public, sort of upon request, but not necessarily provided by FDA or some other government agency, just sort of out there on a website. So if you are interested in a summary basis of approval document for a drug that's not yet available on FDA's own site, that can be requested as an FOI request. As I mentioned before, adverse event information from specific MedWatch reports can be can be required, those requests can be submitted as well. FOI Services has a large number and growing number of documents that it has obtained and are electronically available for sale to people, and so many times if you make a request of information to FOI Services, you simply pay the fee and the information is available almost immediately. However, if they don't already have the information and they have to get it through an FOI request, that's what can take a lot of time.
Okay, thanks. Hey, how much does it cost to use the AERS database?
Well, actually, getting the information is not costly. I mean, there's no charge specifically for the data set. Although what you get is something that's very difficult to use yourself. And if you can actually make AERS requests for information through commercial search services such as Dialog, and that doesn't cost very much. In practice, there is some expense to doing an AERS search and analysis, because unless you have the software and the IT capability yourself in-house, you need to go through a vendor. And so there's some cost that has to do with vendor expenses. I guess as a generality, I would say that if you're putting together an NDA submission and you have reason to include in your safety evaluation an AERS analysis of some related product that's out there, and you go through a vendor and have them obtain and go through all the QC and all that kind of stuff with the data set, and then provide you with particular tables of interest, you're probably talking about an expense of $10,000 or $15,000, something of that nature. That's not the cost for the data itself, but that has to do with once the data are obtained, working with those systems and doing all the IT-related work.
Okay, good, thank you. If a healthcare professional submits non-serious cases, are they going to be included in AERS?
Yeah, basically anything that comes in as a MedWatch report that meets minimal criteria ends up in AERS. And minimal criteria basically means that there's a problem identified in an identifiable patient. To be an identifiable patient, all you need is some information about gender or age or something. So it's very minimal, but the idea being that there's evidence that there is a specific patient in mind with the report. And so you'll see cases that are non-serious as well as serious. FDA is more interested in serious cases, so that's really what it was intended for. But probably, I don't know, maybe 20-25% of cases in AERS for any given drug might be non-serious. Obviously, if you're looking for a non-toxic drug, generally non-toxic drug information, that there may be more of the non-serious cases, and if you have a highly toxic drug, that may be much more weighted toward the serious. The other thing, beyond your question specifically, that's important to recognize is that when a MedWatch report is submitted to AERS, a seriousness criteria is applied to the case such that the case is considered serious or non-serious as a whole. And there may be more than one, there may be quite a number of adverse events that come out of a case, that are coded out of a case based on the narrative. And if your case is considered serious from the regulatory perspective, and so a common situation would be someone that was hospitalized because of a side effect. All the side effects, all the adverse events that are coded out of that case record are identified as serious. So it's very obvious that this is not reality in a particular case record. Someone may have been hospitalized because of what turned out to be a heart attack, but other adverse events that come out of the narrative might include hangnail. So obviously that's not a serious medical problem, but it does get categorized as an SAE, as a serious adverse event, because the case as a whole was. Okay.
All right, thanks. We're just about out of time here. I just want to let the audience know that we will be sending you the presentation plus the questions and answers. You should, on the left side of your screen, see a survey panel, and I encourage you to just take a moment to fill that out. That's be very helpful to us. And finally, I'd like to thank Bob for his presentation and also our audience for joining in. Thanks, and have a great day.